Hello, and welcome to I Am Dad Podcast with your fatherhood authority, Kenneth Braswell. 30 minutes of wisdom, information, resources, and nugget on your fatherhood journey. Or maybe you're just curious and want to hear some real talk about fatherhood, family, and the minds of men. Well, guess what? We got you too. Sit back, grab your pad and pen, and maybe even bring a little something to sip on. Enjoy 30 straight minutes of fatherhood, family, and fun with the Fatherhood Authority, Kenneth Braswell.
Welcome to I Am Dad Podcast. I'm your host, Kenneth Braswell. Thank you for joining us another Sunday morning or whenever it is you happen to be listening to us. We're happy to have you as always as we continue to bring, such great and profound guests. 2024 has been incredible with the guests that we have. I guess we're getting better like fine wine, right? But we're digging so deep into this conversation around fatherhood and more specifically masculinity and manhood and family and more specifically Black families. Obviously, when people listen to our podcast and see the guests on our podcast, we might look a certain way. 90% of what we talk about can be applied across all families, whatever your ethnicity is, whatever your culture is, it cuts across all spaces, but it's interesting because I am now getting back to writing my memoir. And I've been piecing it together for some time, but have just made a decision this morning. It's time for me to hurry up and get this. But there was a line that I wrote in the intro, and this is probably like 2 years ago. And I was talking about how old I was. And I said, for 55 years, I've been a Black man. And that's the only element of my resume that can't be disputed, which is why I focus so hard on it and can speak so in depth about that subject. And today will be no different as we explore the intricacies of fatherhood, masculinity, and societal challenges that shape them. We're honored to have Dr. Nazsa Baker with us as we delve into her groundbreaking research, protect and provide perceptions of manhood and masculinities amongst disabled, violently injured Black men. In a hospital-based violence prevention program. Dr. Baker, a distinguished scholar at the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center and an assistant professor at the Gwynedd, hope I said that right, Mercy University, brings a wealth of knowledge from her extensive work on urban health disparities, violence and injury prevention, and notably the support needs of navigating the aftermath of firearm violence. Through her lens, we'll explore the transformative of Black men as they redefine manhood amidst the challenges of disability and societal expectations. Join us as we uncover the layers of resilience, identity, and the pressing need for empathetic support in the wake of violence. How you doing, Dr. Baker?
Hello, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for joining I Am Dad Podcast. I'm so ready to dive into. I've read so much of your stuff. I had like 30 questions. I was like, I can't answer 30 questions. So, and I typically don't even go by the questions. I go by the conversation, which is probably what we're going to end up doing today. Okay. But if you have not listened to I Am Dad Podcast, we start our podcast off a particular way. Because it informs me with respect to who I'm talking to, and it informs our audience with respect to this perspective that you might do your work from. And that question is, tell us your daddy story. However you want to tell it, wherever you want to tell it, whatever angle you want to tell it from, tell us your daddy story.
So my parents never married. So of course I get two differing stories as to why they weren't together when I was born. However, my mom did leave that line of communication open for my dad. So I grew up in East Orange, New Jersey, in a household with my mom, my grandparents, and my great-grandmother until she passed away, I believe, if I remember correctly, in 2001. My dad lived right across the bridge in New York City, specifically on Harlem. And we would periodically see each other, not often. When I was younger, my dad was incarcerated a few times. I vaguely, remember his incarceration periods because, again, the there were so many times where I did not speak to him for a significant amount of time that a lot of things just kind of blur and, just like are just very much spread out for me. There was a time period in high school where I think I didn't talk to him for about 3 years. And then started rebuilding my relationship with him post college. So at this point, I'm in graduate school in Bronxville, New York, where I had to go there 2 days out of the week my first year. So typically the second day I would have to go to school, I would just make my way into New York City and hang out with him. So our hanging out would include like restaurants, going to bars. At this point, I'm a grown woman, right? So our way of bonding was just like going out and hanging out, not really doing the things my mom and I would do, like travel, shopping, and different things like that. Until this day, we have a pretty reasonable, relationship where we communicate probably once every 3 weeks, maybe a few times out of the month. So it's consistent, but not that consistent.
Thank you for sharing that, because that is a mirror of so many relationships. We just released a report not too long ago called Atlanta Dads, the myth and impact of non-resident on dads, and what that does to relationships and the difficulty in mending past hurts and absence, right? When you're on non-resident, because you don't get the same level of connection with your kids when you don't live with them from day to day. I was born and raised in New York City, so I get you. I was born in Crown Heights, and my mother moved to East New York when I went to the military, so I know Brooklyn and New York City extremely well. I moved upstate New York for school, and then 10 years ago moved here to Atlanta. And so I understand, a lot. It mirrors my story in the sense that I didn't meet mine until I was 23 years old, and he and his family lived in Coney Island. And I didn't know. My mom happened to run into a friend of his on Pickett Avenue one day, and she was like, "Oh my God, my Kenny just came home, and Doug wants to see him." And there's a whole story that follows that. And then he, unfortunately, some years later passed away, but we never got to connect because we did exactly, or tried to do what you were just explaining, which was try to find a way to get together. And then when you get together, you try to find something that you connect with. And then when you're connecting, you're trying to not have a whole hour of small talk just to be talking. And, it's an awkward thing. But I believe that all is a part of absence, of no fault of mom, of no fault of dad, of no fault of child. You can have the greatest relationship, as I do with my youngest daughter. We're connected at the hip, but she doesn't live with me. And there are holes in our relationship as a result of that, for very small things that people don't pay attention to. Like I said to her a couple of months ago, we were having a conversation, and I said, I don't know what it's like to sit on the couch with you and just randomly want to watch a TV show together.
Yeah.
And she had never thought about that before. And I said, it's nobody's fault. It's just that I'm not in the space to do that. But there's intimacy in that. There's intimacy in the randomness of relationships. And so thank you for sharing that, which leads me to, why have you decided to focus on men, particularly Black men?
I get that question a lot. And that was actually one of the questions my dad asked me, because he was like, "You're not a Black man. Like, what do you know?" Right. So one of the things that I've been tasked with, that one of my mentors, Dr. Joseph Richardson, who does similar work as myself in Maryland, is to think about your positionality, right? And thinking about my positionality is yes, I do research on Black men, and specifically violently injured Black men. But who am I as a privileged Black woman with a PhD doing this work with this particular population? And for me, I like to call my journey very serendipitous. I didn't go into my PhD program saying like, hey, I'm going to do research on violently injured Black men. It was around the time when I was thinking about what I wanted to write my dissertation on. And I had like a few key words. It was like trauma, Newark, because at the time I was living in Newark and was going to Rutgers, Newark for my PhD in children. And just, I couldn't piece it together. So with some of the conversations I had with some advisors and some new mentors, it led me to a trauma surgeon at one of our level 1 hospitals in Newark, where she was like, hey, I have this program. I have a student already that is doing the quantitative piece. I know you talked about doing this qualitative piece where you want to like listen to the narratives of some of the men who've been injured. I have a program, like come here and do it with me. So that's when I started building a rapport with the trauma surgeon, the caseworkers of the program. And I did a small focus group for a class, which and then just evolved into me doing my research, evaluating this particular hospital-based violence intervention program, but through the narratives of the participants, where in this case, it was Black men who've been shot.
Are the stories key for you? Because I'm thinking that for a lot of folks that when you get into this work, particularly researchers that I speak to, there's something about the narrative that draws them in.
Yeah, the gun violence research space is fairly small. I think till this day, still very white. So we still have a dearth of Black and brown researchers that are doing this work. And when I was writing my dissertation, I just kept seeing numbers, and I'm like, okay, like we're more than just numbers, right? Black men are just more than numbers. We saw a lot of researchers focusing on mortality. Okay, so we know that we're dying, but what's happening to the lives of those who are living? And for me, I think it was important to uplift their stories. And it just so happened that at the time I was doing my dissertation, it was COVID. So not only am I speaking to a vulnerable population, but this is being done during a vulnerable time for everybody, right, around the globe. So doing this work, I had thought it would be difficult, and it was, but it ended up being very joyous for me to listen to their narratives, but also sad at the same time, just because of some of the questions that I asked them. And a lot of times when I would get on the phone and do these interviews, they didn't even think about the questions that I asked them.
Right. When you, when I saw the report and saw what the subject matter was, immediately I thought about Boys in the Hood, and I thought about the young man in Boys in the Hood that was in a wheelchair. And then there was a really short scene in Friday where there was a young man in a wheelchair in Friday. And it's kind of interesting in the sense that I have only seen those images in movies that depict communities in California. I've never seen that on the East Coast. I've never seen that in New York. I've never seen what you're describing in New York. And I'm wondering in my mind, and I was wondering then, like, why is that? Why does it seem like that is something that is more of a West Coast thing than an East Coast thing? But don't answer that question yet, because that's just me thinking. Talk to me a little bit about this particular issue around violence and disabilities in Black men, and introduce us to your report. Tell us about the report.
So yeah, that report stemmed from my dissertation work. And funny enough, as I've been telling people, that actually wasn't a chapter in my dissertation. When I started my postdoc, the advice I got was, make sure you publish papers from your dissertation. So I said, okay, and this was for my first year. I said, okay, let me sit with these 10 interviews that I did. Was going through them, and I just kept like reading and highlighting, and I'm like, these men are talking about like, what does it mean to be a man? some of them were, majority of them were disabled. But what does that mean in the context of being shot? What does that mean in the context of being a Black man? How do you be a man and you're disabled? How do you live up to hegemonic masculinity, or what is known as patriarchy or white manhood, and the scheme of all of this? So when I sat down with these narratives, I noticed that a lot of guys were talking about, we had one young guy who was about 21. He became a paraplegic. That's rough, right? The first few prominent years in your life, you're walking. So you're going from being able-bodied to disabled. Wow. And what does that look like being so young, right? Can you be a dad, right? Can you engage in sexual activities as a young boy probably might want to? Can you go play basketball with your friends? Can you just walk out the house in the neighborhood in which you are harmed in and, be free, right? And a lot of these things weren't thought about when I was asking, when the guys were telling me their stories. And I had one guy who we interviewed, and he had the tip of his thumb blown off. And he said, I'm disabled, but I'm really not disabled. But it's also hard for him to work, right? Because you need the joint in your thumb to be able to grasp things. We did have a few that were we did have two that were disabled and working, but they talked about the pain, right? The pain, it's like, yeah, I'm working, but a lot of these men are living in disadvantaged communities where you're going to end up doing laborious work. And this particular guy was working on a truck. So he said just getting in and out of the truck on a daily basis, was painful because of the rod in his leg. So by the time he would get home, he would have to rest his legs and put ice on his legs. And I think in this world of firearm violence, we think about it originally as mortality, right? Who's dying? And then soon after, we're starting to think about, well, who are the survivors? What is life like for the survivors? And I think for me, I wanted to take it a step further and, okay, we have people surviving, but what does survival look like when you have a firearm acquired disability? We talk about people that acquire disabilities at birth. We talk about people that acquire disabilities from car accidents. But nowhere are we talking about the men and even women that are injured from community violence where they acquire this disability. And I think a lot of it stems from racism, right? Institutional racism, where it's like, well, if you live in your Brownsville, if you live in your Newark or East Orange or Camden's, it's a way of life, right? Or that happened to you because you were doing something that, you weren't supposed to be doing. But then we don't think about what does that look like in terms of how we perform our gender roles? So for Black men in this particular study, that's why I called it protect and provide, right? A lot of them were like, to be, and I never asked what is it like to be a Black man? I asked what it's like to be a man. So I didn't make it racial, ethnicity specific. And they were like, of course, you got to protect, you got to provide. And by providing, they're talking about financially. But how can you do those things where you're not working, you're unemployed, and you're unemployed not because you don't want to work, but you're unemployed because of your disability, and you may not be getting your Social Security disability check just yet. What does this concept of protection look like for yourself if you are utilizing crutches, a wheelchair, a motorized wheelchair, if you have a prosthetic or even a colostomy bag? What does that look like, right? And then when you layer it on with the criminal justice piece, what does that look like if you already have a felony and you feel the need to, you should be protecting yourself. You want to utilize your right to bear arms, but you have a record, right? So now it's like, I can't carry because I might go to jail or prison, but I also need to protect myself. But also, if I'm handicapped, I'm in an even more vulnerable state. So what does that look like? And I think there hasn't been research out there to show what does this look like? What does protecting and providing look like? And I think this is where I get into this piece of saying, I think violently injured Black men who have firearm acquired disability should think beyond hegemonic masculinity. We should think beyond what white men are doing, whether they're the breadwinner, whether they're the ones out there working, whether they're the ones that can actually protect and carry firearms. We need to think beyond that and think about the soft skills, right? The skills that a lot of these men think only belong to women. So there's nothing wrong with being that person that's at home and nurturing the children. It may look different, especially if you have a visible or visible disability, but just acquiring new skills that, may be placed on women that they can also embody as well without labeling themselves as weak or less of a man.
I suspect for you, just like with me, when we're talking about fatherhood, that there is a large majority of people that would say to me and have said to me, like, why are you doing that? Why are you wasting your time? Like working with dads, you should be working with people who really need the help. You should be working with moms and children. And then more specifically, when you drill down and you start talking about Black men, then there is this stereotypical lens that says, like, really? Like, why are you wasting your time doing this? But if we take an even deeper dive to where you are, where we're talking about Black men and violence and disability and injury, the first question in that person's mind is, well, what were they doing to get in that position, and why should we be worried about that? Have you gotten hit with that, and what does that look like?
Actually, I haven't. No one's asked me that. I think for me, I've taken it upon myself to think about, like, what if someone asked me that? And I think this is where I would like to see my research translate into policy. I want to see the American Disabilities Act be very inclusive to those Black and brown people that have firearm acquired disabilities. I want to see Black and brown people that have to go back to the neighborhoods in which they were harmed, be able to access things like the elderly can. So if we're having Black men in particular do what I call involuntarily aging in place or voluntarily aging in place, right? Because they're afraid to go outside, they should have access to Meals on Wheels. They should have access to in-home nurses. They should have access to these things because sometimes they are afraid to go outside to get food there. And again, if you're in a wheelchair, you're even more vulnerable, especially if you were already harmed in the community in which you have to go back to.
When you think about those particular dads as well, there is this service need, right? And so they have this disability and those things going on, but there's this kind of really basic service need, right? Which is, and could be finding a job. It could be getting economic and income support assistance. It could be health with no health insurance. It could be a lot of different things. Have you seen that particular struggle with these fathers that with these men that you're working with?
So with my study, employment was hinted at, but a lot of them were unemployed. So a lot of them didn't talk about working. I think at that point, because I got a lot of them when they were still in the midst of their recovery post-injury, they were focused on recovery and physical recovery, mental recovery, what that looks like. Out of the people I interviewed, I only had 2 people that were employed. And I believe either 9 out of the 10 were dads. Majority of them were fathers. But funny enough, none of them spoke about their children.
Really?
None of them spoke about their children. And I asked, and only a few spoke about their spouses or partners. But not in a way of, really talking about how it impacted the children or their spouses, but how it impacts them. So it's more so, I had one guy that talked about this burden, like being a burden. He was like, I'm used to being that person that's the burden lifter. So if someone called my phone, I could go help them out. The plan was for my wife to stop working so she could go back to school, and I have my own business. And then once we transitioned into what happened to him, it just automatically was shut down, where he was like, I'm not a burden lifter. I'm the burden. When I wake up in the morning, I try to stay in one spot because I don't want to bother anybody in my household. So it's like this burden on, he saw himself as a burden on others by way of like losing in his mind his independence, right? Of being able-bodied. And yeah, none of them, like when I asked, like, do you think this impacted your children? They were like, yeah, but like nothing in depth. Some of them didn't tell their children what happened to them, but not a lot of reaction around their incident on their families.
I have a really good friend in the Baltimore area, Dr. Janice Stevenson. I interviewed her some time ago. She's a psychologist, and we were talking about trauma-informed care. And I was saying to her that one of the challenges for me with respect to trauma-informed care, specifically for Black men, is that we haven't adequately named and defined their traumas and what they look like. So when I saw you talking about ACEs, that stuck me because that's right where I am. So let me tell you where I am in this whole ACEs conversation as it relates to fathers specifically. I believe that fatherlessness should be an ACE. That
Absolutely.
There's a different level and kind and unique trauma that occurs as a result of a child not having their fathers in their lives. And then everything else is a layer, right? So what you're talking about in this particular space, where we're talking about these dads who have these disabilities as a result of violence, is a layer on top of that absence, right? And you can't really get down to the absence because things keep getting layered for them. And so when we talk about trauma-informed care, we don't really identify it. To me, that, and you described it as that this is a level of trauma that we should be talking about. Talk to me a little bit about what that looks like and how and why have you defined this as being a trauma?
Yeah. So with that particular study, what's missing, I think I've like been comfortable with saying this out loud. I'm anti adverse childhood experiences, right? I am pro adverse lifespan experiences because I believe that there are things that happen across the lifespan, right? And sometimes things that occur when we are 0 to 18, we can't fully process it. And it doesn't hit us until we're older and then the brain is more developed. So for example, when I said to you, like, my dad was incarcerated, I haven't thought about that for years, right? Like my dad hasn't been incarcerated for years. And that happened when I was probably around maybe 7 or 8. So in thinking about the impact that had on me, I really couldn't tell you, right? And it might not hit me until maybe later on in life, or maybe if I like sat down and did some reflecting on like, did that ever actually impact me? I'm not sure. But what I think what's interesting about these adverse child experiences is when it comes to the Black population, one, this particular tool hasn't been validated in the Black population. And two, if we're going to have a tool like that, it needs to be culturally congruent and it needs to be representative of Black people, right? So like you said, like, I didn't even think about that, right? Fatherlessness or motherlessness.
Absolutely.
And also even for me, thinking about kinship ties. So when we have parents that have multiple jobs, if we have a single mom that's working multiple jobs and maybe she's at work by the time you get off of school, you're going to go to auntie, you're going to go to your uncle's house, you're going to go to your grandmother's house, right? That's very, like, that's what we do in a Black household because of this whole, it takes a village, right? Now, there are debates whether that's shifted or not, but again, that's a part of what we do, right? We go from household to household to take care of everybody. In terms of like these layers of trauma, I agree. I think that we're not having enough conversation of what these traumas look like, or individually, we may not identify them as traumas. And this is why want to move past toward trauma informed care to trauma active, right? Because we all can be informed about something, right? We can be informed, but it doesn't mean that it activates us. It doesn't mean that we're actively doing this trauma informed care. I think that sometimes we need to take a few steps back and think about like our own selves. And then when we are talking to others, like clearly hear like the words people are saying. And I always bring up to my friends and I say like, yeah, like back in the day, you know, our grandmothers or mothers will be like, you know, my nerves are bad. Right. That's anxiety, right? Like,
right.
Like anxiety literally stemmed from a form of trauma. Like, what are we talking about? What are we talking about? Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the interesting thing is that when you said that my nerves are bad, I was thinking you getting on my nerves. That was the one that I was about to say in my mind. But, you know, in that other space, the space that's not ours, right? I believe that oftentimes when it comes to Black people, both men and women, right, that they believe that trauma is synonymous with excuse. Or
normalization. Because we tend to, in a lot of my interviews around, and that was another thing, right? The one question I started out every interview with was, tell me about your childhood, right? And a lot of these men told me so many traumatic things that wasn't even comparable to the questionnaire that had 10 questions. I was like, wow, like this is interesting. And one of the questions that stood out most that they had trouble answering was, I think it's towards the end of the scale. It goes, were your parents ever separated or divorced? So that'd be like, hold up, my parents were never married. So how do I answer this? My parents were never married. So I had to think, I was like, wait, like that's a good question. Like, do we assume that parents were married and legally separated and then divorced? So a lot of all 10 people said my parents were, if we did never married or separated, they said yes. So we're looking at this breakdown of households. Right. We're looking at, a lot of them were exposed to frequent moving. A lot of them were exposed to domestic violence, breaking up of families where mothers were losing custody of their children because of loss. And by loss, I don't mean death, because sometimes I want to get away from the death piece and look at it as lost their mom to substance abuse, right? Lost their mom because of whatever reasons the welfare system came in and took them away from their mothers. And one guy even talked about how his dad came and got him. And I believe this particular person was in their 30s, and I said, well, why'd your dad come and get you? He said, you know what, to be honest, I can't even tell you why he came and got me. It doesn't even till this day. Wow. You know, it's interesting because, you know, one of the things that, you know, folks don't like to talk about because they believe it takes them back to a period they want to forget is this whole notion of post-traumatic slave syndrome, right? But I've always said that that's only one of the conversations that we need to have as Black people, because we also need to have a conversation around post-traumatic Jim Crow syndrome and post-traumatic segregation syndrome. And so it's almost like now that we're not enslaved anymore, that we don't have no traumatic instances, life experiences, where we continue to have adverse life experiences as a result of racism. And I think that is a conversation that needs to be lifted up. And I love your point about ACEs is not a tool that is culturally competent or even expresses the traumas that specifically Black families go through, and more specifically, Black men go through, and Black women in their own way, because there's pieces that are happening to Black women now that are beginning to separate themselves. But it's interesting about this, Dr. Bacon, is those two things impact each other. And we're not talking about that, right? So when you look at maternal morbidity, right, and it becomes this thing that
for Black women that we need to talk about, because our Black women are dying on birthing tables. But what we're not talking about is, for many of these Black women who are dying on birthing tables, there is a father that's picking up these kids that are now the single parent of these kids. And these single parents are not looked at the same way as single parents are looked like, and they're struggling in the support services space. And so even in our program in Atlanta, we have had an increase of fathers who are homeless with children and have nowhere to go because shelters don't exist for them. And that's a whole nother conversation that we have to talk about. But I want to talk about a little bit, because this report was also grounded in the fact that it was being associated with a hospital-based violence intervention program. Talk to me a little bit about that and what that is and how that plays a role in this conversation.
Yeah, so these hospital-based, or what we call linked intervention programs, are programs that are geared toward addressing essentially the social determinants of health of anybody, but specifically, depending on where you live, Black and brown men who've been violently injured, whether it's through a gunshot wound, a knife stab wound, or physical assault. So these programs are there to uplift and try to provide services through what we call either caseworkers or violence prevention professionals or community health workers. It just, the term varies depending on where you are and what they want to call them, where they're connected to a case manager, which in turn could be looked at as a peer for them. And they're just connecting them to services. So in particular, mental health services. So they might have referrals to community-based organizations that have clinicians so they can see the therapist. They might need access, help filling out victims of crime applications because they do qualify for that money. They might need help filling out Social Security disability paperwork, maybe getting to and from doctor's appointments. It varies, right? The person's needs varies. It could be, I just was at my new job in San Francisco, and one of the violence prevention workers there was trying to help a client get his dog out of the impound because he was hospitalized. So it could be very micro things to very macro things. But one of the main goals of what we call HVIPs, or hospital-based violence intervention programs, is to make sure that there's no retaliation. So the case workers or managers want to catch them during this golden hour. So in particular, at their bedside while they're inpatient, or during their time in the emergency department. So we have a lot of emerging and already existing HVIPs around the country. And in New Jersey, we have 11, but my dissertation work was focused on the first one in Newark.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we do in our fatherhood, at least I do in the fatherhood space, when I'm talking to folks about fathers in general and Black fathers more specifically, is all outcomes to services we attach to outcomes for children. Right? Mm-hmm. And so everything that we do is about improving the outcomes of children. I just want to give that to you because what you're talking about, particularly understanding that most of these guys that you interview are dads, that working with them and providing them services contributes to an outcome of a child that needs to be talked about, right? That needs to be looked at. You mentioned earlier that one of the things that you'd like to see as a success of this report, and I'm sure future reports, is policy impact and policy change. What kind of policies would you like to see this impact?
So for me, again, I think it's what you're saying. It's being able to obtain services, right, that weren't specifically geared for this population, but they should have access to it, right? So whether it's Section 8 housing, whether it's Meals on Wheels because they can't cook or they live alone and they're afraid to go outside, and just in being able to access even support groups. There aren't a lot of support groups out there for men that have been violently injured. Right. I do know I did a few interviews in South Jersey, and they did, a few of the guys stumbled upon specifically a handicapped support group. I'm not sure of the name of it, but I think this is where now I started to ask men, like, are you disabled, right? Do you consider yourself disabled? And this one particular guy goes, no, I'm handy capable.
Ooh,
So I believe that's I believe he got that word from like the support group, right? I'm not disabled, I'm handy capable. But yeah, I think for me, it's all around services. It's all about services and not making sure people are just surviving, but reaching their optimal levels in terms of health, right? Holistic health, mental, emotional, financial. But a lot of that is rooted in institutional racism, right? So unless we can address poverty, like we need to be able to address the root cause, which is poverty, and then, move out to other issues.
Do you ever find difficulty that this conversation gets caught up in the gun violence conversation or the black on black conversation? Because then that becomes the next thing, right? Which is this could be solved if your community get their act right and they stop doing X, Y, and Z to X, Y, and Z. Does any of this conversation get caught up in that conversation?
Luckily, no.
You are fortunate.
Yeah, I have not experienced that.
I guess I've just been in this game so long. Everything we've tried to do positive always get called out in some space that has nothing to do with anything. But again, it's the pushback to the work, right? It's the relevancy of the work that you're doing, which is, what I will pray for you. And that is that people get the relevancy in what it is you're trying to talk about and what it is you're trying, and not as a result of the great work that you're doing, but the folks that it is attached to and how society sees those individuals and determine whether or not they are worthy, of any kind of attention on any level, whether it is research, services, policy, law, all of those kinds of things. When you think about practitioners and service, because that's kind of the space that I'm in as well, working with fatherhood agencies around the country that are working with dads who are having all kinds of issues, right? Whether it is mental health, homelessness, and other child support, anger management, co-parenting, relationships, all those things. Will then be those dads, because there are groups out there that are fatherhood groups that are either dads with disabilities who have kids or dads who have children with disabilities. So if there's a group out there that is actually working with dads and they're coming across a dad who has that level of disability, what kind of services should they have in place and what should they know about that individual?
I think first and foremost, a long-term intensive case manager that helps connect them to services. So I think first and foremost, primarily, is not only just connecting them to services, but connecting them to a person that they can connect with, right? Because what we find in the Black community is because there's distrust in a lot of these institutional systems, at this point, we're in a place of needing to build rapport, right? And we want these individuals that are doing the work to have lived experiences and also look like them. So I think for me, like just bringing it back to my research, what made me so relatable and that the guys felt comfortable with doing the interviews with me, especially over the telephone where they couldn't see me, was one, I had a relationship with the caseworkers who could verify who I am. And two, I was from a similar neighborhood as them. So that's where we connected quickly on those levels. But when we're talking about being able to obtain services, we need people that look like the population that they're going to work with, right? So hiring a white person may not fit the cut, right? They may be what we think is qualified on paper, right? But do they have access to local community-based organizations as if someone else down the street that may not look good on paper has those connections with, right? Will that person be able to trust them? Like, we need this rapport. We need to talk about trust building with service providers and recipients of these services. That's really big. Because we do find that even in this space that some of these guys won't even take on like take some of the services because of what they're named and probably who's delivering the services.
Yeah, that's definitely you in our space now. With these dads, we have a grant with the Office of Family Assistance to serve 900 fathers over the course of 5 years. We're now in our 4th year of serving these dads here in Metro Atlanta. And we are really doing an awesome job in bringing these dads. And we've, amassed a network of over the last 3.5 years and doing this work specifically here of over 8,000 dads in Metro Atlanta, and 99% of them are Black. And so we're really trying to figure out, how do we continue to expand our services to not allow folks to come in, and particularly researchers, and this is not you, but I am extremely protective of my dads from researchers. And there is an African proverb that says, as long as the hunter is writing the story, the narrative of the lion will never be told. And I really believe that from a research perspective, that people who research our communities to articulate what they're hearing, to form and then write the narrative of what they're hearing, and then to activate what they're hearing in the space, has to come from folks who look like us. And that's not to say that they can't do it from a professional qualification perspective, but from a connect. It happens, when someone has a connect with the community that they're serving. That's why I love what you're doing. And so when I have researchers call me, and I have them call me all the time, and they'll be like, what this like, we'll give them a $25 gift certificate. We want to interview them. I was like, when you up that,
That's not enough.
yeah, when you up that to $500, call me back. When you up it to $500 for 1 hour, call me back. My dads get $500 an hour if you want to interview you. And obviously I don't hear from them again, but that's because you're not serious about what it is you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish. And I think that as a people, we need to be more guarded with allowing our narratives to be told in a way that doesn't benefit the families that we're trying to serve in these spaces. What's next for you? I know that there's more. Are you just digging in this right now, or do you got something else hot on the burner?
So, actually a few things. So, like I said, I'm transitioning to a position in San Francisco.
How's that? New York to San Francisco. What's that like?
Well, I'm still here in Jersey, so it's going to be interesting. Very interesting. I didn't think that I would end up in California. It wasn't at the top of my list. Okay. But I'll be running one of the original hospital-based violence intervention programs and doing research there. So in addition to that, I do have a paper coming out called, I Am a Survivor. So this is where I wanted to give Black men that were violently injured the opportunity to ask them, like, do you consider yourself a survivor or a victim? Mm-hmm. And so we have that. That should be published through the Journal of Urban Health very soon. And then next, I'm also collaborating with one of my mentors, Dr. Christopher St. Ville at a University of Buffalo School of Social Work, and Hashim Garrett. He actually did a roundtable interview with me for WNYC. Okay. He experienced firearm. He has a firearm acquired disability, but he experienced it at 15. So the three of us are collaborating on a paper, basically trying to ask the question, what can able-bodied men learn from disabled Black men who've acquired firearm disabilities? So coming from this love ethic approach, like this bell hooks, so it'll be for a magazine. And also just doing more research and embedding myself in the San Francisco community, understanding what that's like, but still continuing the work that I have here on the East Coast with some of the HFIPs that I work closely with.
Okay. Well, stay in touch, and as those papers come out, let me know. I got you locked in now, and so I'll see them. I'll see you post them on LinkedIn, and then you'll be hearing from me because I want to keep these
Absolutely.
conversations going. And if there's any other colleagues in your space that have articles that are specific to Black men, please send them to me
I have a
because I
whole list.
love to expose the works of Black researchers. Right? It's in an ironic way has become my most favorite like interviews when I'm talking to researchers because and like our folks are just brilliant anyway. I mean they
Absolutely.
just are. And I just love it when they narrow in on something and speak about it because it feeds me. It feeds my work. It feeds the justification of my work. It feeds the solutions of my work. And now I get to point back to real research and evidence that comes from and says that this is what our folks need and this is what it looks like. I don't have to get the okay from other researchers around the country that have become the traditional validators of information, right? And so this is what works for our people. But then the extension of that is to be able to translate, this is what we're doing with the Moynihan Institute, is taking research that is to a certain extent academic and extracting it and making it real life language so that practitioners can actually use it and implement it in the work that they're doing, right? And so that is a lot of what I try to do with the podcast is take research and simplify it for people so that when they look at it, they can say, oh, okay, this is evidence that this works. And so to your point earlier about this whole notion of, so we talked about trauma informed and trauma active, you talked about, but then there's this other term, right? Evidence based and evidence informed, right? See, I see you. You do the same thing I do. It's like, whatever, right? And so to me, for many of our communities, evidence informed is much more important than evidence based. If it's working for us, I don't need anybody to validate that what's working for us is working, right?
Yeah.
And that there's a difference between outputs and outcomes. Outputs are those things that grants worry about. Outcomes are those things that communities and people worry about. How is what you're doing impacting these communities for the health and well-being of the people who live there? Outputs are how many are you doing of what you said you were going to do for the benefit of satisfying the quals for the grant. Those are two very different things. And I think that there has to be a broader, more national conversation. Like it could be out here already, and I don't know that it's out here, but there really needs to be a national convening of Black researchers and
Yeah.
for Black families. And then you could carve it up how you want to carve it up, but Black researchers should be coming together annually and talking about the brilliance and the works that they're putting out there so that we can become more exposed to it because I'm a different kind of cat. I dig for it. And so when I find it and it pops up, it's like, oh, like she's in Rutgers. She's like across the water from where I used to live, blah, blah, blah. Let me go on LinkedIn and holler and see if I can get them. And I have not been able to get one person that I've reached out to. Every researcher that I get wants to talk about their work, and deservingly so, right? They should talk about their work. You should. And I'm going to be amplifying your name. I'm going to be amplifying your work. Be on the lookout to hear from some people that I want to connect you with so that you can get your work a little deeper into these spaces. And if
And I
there's
will say this too, like we do have the newly created Black and Brown Gun Violence Research Collective that is co-directed by Dr. Shawnee Buggs from UC Davis and Dr. Joseph Richardson at University of Maryland. And Dr. Richardson also is the first Black leadership to run a gun center in the U.S. Traditionally, the majority of the gun centers are ran by white men.
okay.
And he's the only Black person that's running a gun center.
Are y'all doing any convenings? Do you know?
So we just had a soft launch last July. So we're getting together to push it out there. I'll share there's some stuff that's been shared on LinkedIn about the Black and Brown Collective, but hopefully it'll be more formalized this year.
Okay, well, keep me in mind. Let me know so I can show up and figure out how to connect this. And we are also having a conference under our federal contract. We're having a national fatherhood conference in Atlanta in August. And so it's filling up pretty quickly. I have to put this conversation on the slate to see if it's something that the feds would like to talk about. But when the information comes out, I will make sure that you get it, and so that I can find ways to get you into those spaces as well. Dr. Baker, it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And to my I Am Dad podcast listeners, thank you so much for joining us again. If you want any information about Dr. Baker, make sure you go to iamdadpodcast.com, where we'll have links to her and her LinkedIn page and her report and all of that good stuff. And you know how I like to leave you. Always be kind to others as you're kind to yourself. You might find yourself by yourself. Always shoot high for your goals, because even if you miss, you'll be amongst the stars. And that's my good friend Art Mitchell used to always say to me, it's nice to be important. But you know what? It's much more important to be nice. Until next Sunday, peace out.
Thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us. You've been listening to I Am Dad Podcast. We hope that you have been informed, encouraged you to think, or even inspired your heart for the love of dads. The conversation does not end here. Come back and join us next week. Same time, same place. Or you can continue the dialogue on our I Am Dad Facebook page. We also invite you to listen to past episodes, learn more about us, and keep up with special activities by visiting iamdadpodcast.com. That's iamdadpodcast.com. Until next time, I leave you with this reminder of manhood from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Because of this reminder, I will always understand that I am dad, period.